Hello and welcome to October with the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I know sometimes it's sort of a scary month, October, but for us, it is not. I am thrilled to say that I have two of my very favorite authors joining us. Helen Castor, who has written an amazing new book about the time of transition from Richard II to Henry IV and everything that means. Also, Remy Targoff, who has a fascinating book, Shakespeare's Sisters, How Women Wrote the Renaissance. It's just amazing. So I can't wait for you to listen to these. I'm so glad you're here on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics in October. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am thrilled, and I mean it, thrilled to be joined by one of my favorite historians and authors, Helen Castor. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about history and your new book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. So you have this great new book out, but before we jump in, I'd like to just ask a little about what brought you into history, what made you decide to be a historian, and how it became, this project. You've done a lot of other books, but what about this time period really enticed you?
To go all the way back to the beginning means going back decades now, because I fell in love with history when I think I was 4 or 5. My parents were very good at taking us around historic sites, but they were also very, very good at buying a little bookworm books. And very early on, they bought me Jean Plady's 2 books for children, The Young Elizabeth and The Young Mary Queen of Scots. And those books were where it all began for me, really. I still have them. Every single illustration is printed on my retinas, I think. So I never really thought about where it might lead. I just knew that history was my favorite subject. And all through school, I was reading lots of history. I knew I wanted to study history. I didn't think about beyond university, really. I did know, or I thought I knew, that I was a Tudor person, a Tudor historian. And so I was delighted when at school, in the end, my last 2 years at school, we were able to study the Tudors. This was marvelous. This was teeing me up for doing the Tudors at university. Got to university and discovered everything I thought I knew was wrong. Felt very, very disconcerted, wondered, okay, where can I go for a reset? I was already, how can you be interested in the 16th century and not love the 15th? So I thought, right, I'll go backwards. And as soon as I found myself in the Middle Ages, I just thought, right, this is where I'm supposed to be. But I still didn't think I was going to be a historian. What would that even mean, really? So in my last year at university, I was studying all the medieval papers I could, but I had another job lined up. I was very lucky. I'd got a job offer, entry-level job offer in publishing. But at the very last minute, I thought, I'm not ready to give this up. And was so lucky to get a place to do a PhD. So really, I just followed my nose into it. Ended up as an academic, again, all sorts of strokes of luck and good fortune and some support from some amazing historians, and really loving my PhD and diving into that. Ended up teaching in Cambridge, which I loved and learned so much from my students. But in the end, what I wanted to do was write narrative history. And I spent a long time, well, I'm trying not to put it all in terms of luck, because then it just sounds as though it all just miraculously happened. But I wrote a very short proposal, sent it to the only agent whose details I had. He was wonderful and worked with me for 6 months on putting together a full-scale book proposal. And that was the point when the next stroke of luck happened, that Blood and Roses, my first book for a general readership, got taken on. And ever since then, I've followed my nose from book to book. So there hasn't been a grand plan. I just love what I do and feel extraordinarily fortunate that it's worked so far. Fingers crossed that it keeps.
That is wonderful. Well, and the books, and I have Blood and Roses on, so I'm a big long time fan. But one of the things I love is the way you present the stories in a very understandable and focusing on the people, not just the events around the people. So it's not just numbers and wars and names of wars. So we come to this latest, The Eagle and the Hart, and the subtitle is The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. And I find that really intriguing because it immediately makes me think of Shakespeare and his coverage of the time. And we can talk about that as well. But how do these two men, they just interact with each other? They are so similar in some ways in their upbringing, and then they are just so different in others. So, talk about these two men who come together at various points in their lives before that very extremely dramatic final point.
It really is an extraordinary story, isn't it? As you're suggesting, they're two men I've been thinking about for a very, very long time because my PhD, which was about the Duchy of Lancaster within English politics in the 15th century up to 1461. Of course, I was starting with this dramatic moment in 1399 where the Duke of Lancaster, the new Duke of Lancaster, Henry of Bolingbroke, takes the throne from his cousin Richard II and becomes king in his place. So he becomes Duke of Lancaster and king, more or less at the same time. But in terms of the academic study I did, I was looking very structurally, very analytically at politics and at the working of the Constitution in late medieval England. Fascinating stuff. But as you were just saying, often within academic work, or at least the academic work that I was doing back then, it was very hard to bring in questions of individual character, individual experience, not least because I was writing analytically. I was writing structurally and analytically. And so over the years, I've so strongly wanted to come back to these two, particularly as I've delved more and more into writing narrative, because as you say, it's the human experience that I'm trying to understand and to bring out. I think we all, perhaps more now than at any point in my life before, certainly, or at least going back a long way, have this sense that none of us quite know what's going to happen tomorrow. The world is a very unstable place. It's a very frightening and dangerous place in lots of ways. And therefore, for individuals to understand what's going on in their lives and to make choices without knowing what's going to be happening tomorrow, that, it seems to me, is an essential part of understanding the unfolding of history. And it wasn't really one that I could look at in this way when I was doing my PhD. And then the other thing, as you say, that's been resonating in my head for all these years are the Shakespeare plays. And Shakespeare, being the genius that he is, the portrait that he gives us of Richard II in the play that bears Richard's name is beyond extraordinary. The poetry in that play, the psychological insight, but it really is a play with one man standing in the spotlight. Henry, Richard's first cousin, almost exactly the same age, 3 months younger, in fact, although we often think of Bolingbroke, Henry IV, as being older than Richard. That's often the way it's played. In fact, younger. Henry only really appears to us in relation to other people. He's Richard's nemesis. And then by the time we get to the Henry IV plays, he's a grey man. He's worn down by the cares of kingship. And it's his son, Prince Hal, who's stepped into the spotlight. So the other thing that I really wanted to do in this book, taking a very long way around back to your original question, is to put Henry alongside Richard and to try to see these two men through the entire course of their lives, given that they were born in almost exactly the same moment and grew up within the same extended family, although in very different relations to the crown, to become such utterly different people. And that was the thing that I thought, in a sense, there's a story we've all been missing here, which is the parallels in these lives, and yet the enormous divergence that you have Richard, who is born to be king. In fact, he has an older brother, but once his older brother's died, he has the right to the crown. But as he grows to adulthood, it becomes clear none of the qualities that you would want in the man wearing the crown. Whereas Henry has all the qualities, he just doesn't have the right. And the $1 million question in their lives, therefore, is how do you square that circle? What to do once all Richard's inadequacies and the problems that his own approach to kingship produces, and problems is an understatement by the time we get to 1399, what can you do about that? I've now got the light shining on me. God is speaking. If I just pull this curtain here, sorry.
No, that's good.
What can you do about that in a situation where Richard is God's anointed? He's anointed and crowned. He has an unequivocal right to be king, but he has no understanding of the responsibilities of the job.
That's such a good question. What do you do about it? And Richard, in addition to having the right, had such a belief in his right to be king. And in fact, that he therefore was right in everything he decided. It was very much he was going to make the decisions. And by nature of his being king, they were therefore the right decisions. What do you think contributes? Because we see kings before and after him being willing to take advice from others, acknowledging their own frailty, not frailty, but their lack of understanding of everything and asking for input. He would not do that. What helped him be so certain that he was always right?
This is one of the places where I love medieval history because, of course, we don't have any private letters. We don't have his secret diary telling us what he was thinking. We are trying to put a psychological jigsaw together when we don't have half the pieces that we would assume we had if we were talking about someone in the modern world. We can't see behind closed doors. So what we have to do is use the pieces of the jigsaw that we do have. And what I found when I was writing the book was that if I looked in as much detail as I could at Richard's early life, both within the family he grew up and within the political context that surrounded them, it began to make sense. First of all, he's never seen kingship in action. He doesn't have a model to follow in practical terms because his grandfather, the king, Edward III, is by the 1370s, which is the earliest time Richard could possibly have any memory from. He was born in 1367. Edward is old and he's unwell. So he doesn't have a grip on his government, but neither does his son and heir, Richard's father, the Black Prince, who is only in his 40s, but is by now chronically ill. So the two men who might have been able to show Richard the way, show him the ropes, have the authority to tell him, no, you've got the wrong end of the stick here, are out of commission. What Richard hears and understands instead from a very young age, because his older brother Edward died at 5 when Richard was 3. So from his earliest memories, he is the one hope. He is the one remaining heir of his father. What he hears is that he's unique and irreplaceable. He, as far as I can see, is cocooned in a very rarefied kind of cotton wool. He's protected at all costs. No one is going to put the one heir to the throne in any kind of danger. And of course, he then becomes king at the age of just 10, at which point it becomes harder than it's ever been to push him to do anything he doesn't want to. Who's going to make the King of England do his homework if he doesn't want to, with the danger that in 5 years or 8 years or 10 years, he's going to turn around and say, right, you're my least favorite person in the whole world. Your fate is not going to be a very happy one. So the cocoon is gilded, but it's very, very real. And you see this play out in all sorts of ways. Of course, the coronation ceremony, when you're a 10-year-old boy going through that extraordinary sacred ceremony in Westminster Abbey, anointing and then crowning, receiving the acclamation of all your nobles and the people of your realm. But even before that, 6 months before that, as the heir to the throne just after his father's death, Richard had been brought into Parliament and heard himself described in an extraordinary piece of political rhetoric by the Bishop of Exeter, who was the Chancellor, as the Messiah, more or less, that the king has sent the prince to us just as God sent his only beloved son. Well, everyone else in the room knew this was rhetoric. The 10-year-old boy he was talking about seems to have taken a rather different lesson. And then when Richard was 14, you have the Peasants' Revolt erupting and forcing its way into the heart of London, killing the Chancellor and the Treasurer of England. The rebels did, parading their heads around on pikes. And the only person whose authority they are appealing to, they want to get rid of the whole regime, which of course is ruling in Richard's name. Richard's too young to rule for himself at this point. And they're saying they are corrupt, they are mismanaging the realm, they are working against the interests of England. Sire, Lord King, you are the one we appeal to. Now, this too was quite appealing to Richard, and Richard very bravely rides out to meet them, quells them with a word. They are appealing to his authority. It's often said how brave he was, and he was brave, but the rebels were explicit that they recognized no authority but his, and that sounded quite good to Richard at that point. So I think it's an extraordinary story of, in hindsight, how not to bring up a king. Very hard to avoid at the time, but it turned out, sadly for England, that Richard's personality was hearing exactly what he wanted to hear in all of that, and he turns into a particularly brittle kind of narcissist who sees everyone else as two-dimensional compared to his own majesty, his own glory.
Yes, that's wonderfully explained. And there are a couple of pieces of art of the time that really call that out. And one is a religious piece, if I could get you to talk about that. And the other is his coronation portrait that he sort of reimagines that you can see now in the Abbey. So can you tell us about those two and how they reinforce and project that image of himself?
Westminster Abbey was a very special place to Richard. It was where he was crowned in 1377. Glorious building consecrated to England's royal saint, King Edward the Confessor, who becomes more and more and more important in Richard's sense of himself. You're so right to point at the coronation portrait. And I would like just to refer back to the Parliament where Richard, just past his 10th birthday, when his father had died, his grandfather hadn't yet died, was brought into Parliament, described as England's Messiah. That Parliament took place in a beautiful and extraordinary room that doesn't exist anymore, the Painted Chamber in the Palace of Westminster, which burned down in 1834. But back then was covered in wall paintings, stories of biblical kings and tyrants, cartoon strip style round the long walls. But at one end was a painting of the coronation of Edward the Confessor. And we know vaguely what it looked like because a watercolor sketch was done of it in the early 19th century before it was lost for good. And it is a monumental painting of Edward the Confessor on his throne, wearing his crown, surrounded by bishops and archbishops. I can't prove it, but I believe that that painting made such a powerful impression on Richard that the coronation portrait he later commissioned for himself, that now hangs near the west door in Westminster Abbey, which is a life-size, full-length portrait of himself as an adult in the coronation chair, wearing beautiful coronation robes, wearing his crown, holding an orb and scepter. It must have been inspired by a sense of himself in relation to the Saint King. Let's not forget the Saint King, Edward, whose shrine is behind the high altar in Westminster Abbey. It's a painting that glows. It's on a gold background, and there's gold everywhere in the depiction of Richard. It would have glowed even more. There are a particularly over-enthusiastic restoration project in, I think, the 19th century took a lot of the texture off the gold background, which used to, it would have shimmered even more in candlelight and torchlight. But it is an extraordinary depiction of medieval majesty, and there's nothing else like it surviving from the late Middle Ages in England. And it's outshone only by the other piece of art that you were referring to, which we now know as the Wilton diptych, because it was kept for a long time at Wilton House, a great aristocratic house in England. It's a portable altarpiece on hinged panels of oak. It's now in the National Gallery in London. It's small because it's portable. It's about so big. And on the outside, it has Richard's arms, which by this stage in the mid-1390s, when it was commissioned, he was impaling the royal arms of England with the supposed arms of Edward the Confessor. He was identifying so closely with the Saint King that he was using his arms. And on the other side, on the outside, Richard's new badge, the white hart that he was plastering all over his kingdom, churches, palaces, and the men he was retaining to serve him were wearing the badge of the white hart. But inside is its real glory. On the left-hand panel, an exquisite portrait of three saints, Richard's personal patron saints, King Edmund the Martyr, an Anglo-Saxon king of England, also a saint, King Edward the Confessor, and St. John the Baptist, on one of whose feast days Richard had been born. Also the Feast of the Epiphany, where three kings came to give gifts to Christ. So these three saints were already being reminded of the Magi. And Richard kneeling is being presented on the right-hand panel to the Virgin and Child and the ranks of the angels in heaven. Exquisite blue robes, but all of them, all these angels, wearing Richard's badge of the White Hart. It's such a statement of Richard's view of royal authority and how it related to the divine power of God.
Yes. And I think just both of those demonstrate the messages that he is projecting, but it's not always working with his parliaments, let's say. So the Lord's Appellant and all of that, what are people trying to do?
The problem with Richard is that his view of kingship is entirely focused on his rights as king, which he essentially seems to see as, I speak, you obey. The problem is that is not the full picture of what kings ought to be doing. Kings are given their authority by God in order to fulfill responsibilities in relation to the realm. That is, he is supposed to be ruling in the common interest of the realm, and that means internally upholding the law, giving justice to his subjects, externally defending the realm against external attack. Neither of those duties is going very well from a very early stage. England's at war. what we know as the 100 Years' War has already been going on for decades, and this is a phase where it's not going well for England. Richard shows no interest whatsoever in fighting, and that becomes a real problem by the later 1380s, at which point, 1386, England is threatened with invasion by the biggest fleet assembled by the French or anyone on the continent since 1066. So it's a clear and present danger to England that Richard is treating as though it's nothing at all. Not only that, but his sense of how he should relate to his subjects within England is turning out to be not just brittle, but downright dangerous. Anyone who tries to suggest to him that he's not properly focusing on what he should be focusing on, which is, after all, the role of the great nobles to offer him counsel and advice, he starts making clear in 1386, 1387, that he sees that as treason. And treason is a terrifying accusation to come from the king, because anyone who's condemned as a traitor, and Richard seems to be suggesting that he alone, on his own, can say who is and is not a traitor, forfeits not only their life in a particularly grim and horrible way, but also all their possessions. So not only the individual, but their family and their dynasty is destroyed. And that initial conflict of the later 1380s turns out to set the scene for a much worse one in the late 1390s. His subjects are hoping that Richard might have learned his lesson during the 1390s. Turns out, no, he's just been biding his time until he's in a position to launch his revenge, which he does in the last 2 years of his reign. Full-blown tyranny, destruction of the men he sees among his nobles as his chief enemies, and a dilemma for his subjects, particularly his leading subjects, and particularly, it turns out, his cousin Henry. How far will they have to go in the attempt to protect England from the tyranny that Richard has unleashed?
Yeah, so it does get to that point that he is not fulfilling the responsibilities of the monarchy that is as important as the rights or these responsibilities. So during this time, where has cousin Henry been, and what's going on in his life as Richard is becoming more and more of a tyrant?
Henry's been doing his best to live up to the responsibilities that are his as one of the greatest noblemen in the country. Not yet the greatest nobleman in the country, because that's his father, John of Gaunt, Edward III's third surviving son. But by now, because the second surviving son has already died, by now the greatest of Richard's uncles, but therefore first in the firing line for Richard, because what John of Gaunt is trying to do is keep government going, keep the show on the road until Richard's old enough and wise enough to rule for himself. But the wisdom bit turns out to be the problem. So poor Gaunt gets it in the neck from almost everyone, but is trying his best to fulfill his duties, to either fight France or to make peace with France, to look after the interests of England internally. And he's bringing up Henry, his only legitimate son, as best he can to learn what it is going to mean to take over that responsibility. Gaunt has interests internationally as well as within England, one of which is that he has a claim through his second wife to the crown of Castile. May sound as though that's a bit fanciful, but we need to remember that actually Castile was an ally of France in the 100 Years' War, and the Castilian fleet, France didn't have much of a fleet at this point, but of its own, but Castile has a very, very powerful fleet, and actually that's been menacing England. If Castile can be taken out of the war, if John of Gaunt can become king in Castile, that would be a fantastic thing. So Gaunt leaves in 1386, just when Richard really goes off the rails in a major way for the first time. So Henry, who, like Richard, is only a teenager at this point, has a baptism of fire, having been left in charge of his family's interests and therefore with his father's responsibility to look after England too. Henry has to make some very difficult decisions very young, and he decides he will join the resistance against Richard in that early phase of conflict. It's a difficult decision. We can't really see into Henry's head, but it does seem to be to do with that sense of responsibility. When Richard is throwing around accusations of treason, as though there are no laws surrounding the definition of treason, and as though there are no tomorrow, that's when Henry jumps the other way and joins this group of rebel lords who force Richard back into line in the late 1380s. But of course, that then sets the tenor of Henry's relationship with Richard. Richard is not going to forgive that. Henry then, when his father comes back in 1389, both, I suspect because he wants to, but also because it's very politic, takes himself off on a series of very glamorous trips. One to go on crusade in the Baltic to help the Order of Teutonic Knights fight the pagans in Lithuania. And then when he goes back for a second crusading season there, and in fact a treaty has got in the way, he goes off to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. So Henry is really establishing himself as one of the most glamorous and famous young knights in Europe. Again, one suspects that probably isn't going down so well with Richard back home, but at least they're not there rubbing each other up the wrong way. But Henry is back in England by the time the second phase of conflict kicks off in 1397. And he's not caught in the first wave of the acts of violent revenge that Richard takes in 1397, largely because his father Gaunt is still there trying to mediate, trying to keep this new show on the road, trying to restrain Richard's worst excesses. But Henry is caught in the second wave, ends up being exiled, and therefore when Gaunt dies in 1399, pretty much a broken man, Richard has promised that Henry in exile in Paris will be able to inherit his rightful inheritance, because Henry hasn't been found guilty of any crime. This has been an off-the-cuff exile decision that Richard has made in the course of anyone who knows Shakespeare's play will know that Henry and another of the former rebels, Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, were about to fight a duel to establish which, if either of them was a traitor, it's a huge mess at this point. Richard stops the duel and exiles them both, but says they can both inherit any lands that come into their possession while they're away. Richard then goes back on his word. I mean, this is the point at which it becomes clear that nothing Richard says can be trusted. He's prepared to override the law, he's prepared to rewrite the law of treason, and he's prepared to go back on an explicit promise he's formally made. So Henry at that point has to choose: either I lose everything and I abandon England and my family, my young sons, to their fate, or I have to go back, I have to stand up for my legal rights as Duke of Lancaster, and I have to stand up for England and the rule of law against the tyranny that Richard has unfolded. And what that means, it turns out, when he gets back, is he's going to have to take Richard down. And if he takes Richard down, then in practical terms, the only person who can possibly replace him is Henry. And that then poses a challenge, because Henry doesn't clearly have the right to be Richard's heir. He has a claim, he doesn't have the claim. And that's the question on which the story then turns.
Yes. So Henry trying to do the right thing, and has, when he returns from exile, has support of some of the other nobles, right? Because they can see the way this is going. If Richard can take Henry John of Gaunt, I mean, the whole Lancaster, if he can take all of that to himself, the highest noble in the land at the time, then really none of the nobles are safe in the law and these public pronouncements. So this is where in Shakespeare's play, there's a wonderful moment, and the language in Richard II is just, as you say, unforgettable, where Richard prophesies the Wars of the Roses, which will unfold later. So this turning point, and I find just in conversations with people that people know about the Wars of the Roses, but they don't understand this moment when Henry takes the throne and what that really means to force an anointed, crowned king off the throne. So talk to us about why Shakespeare can logically, I mean, we can see that that could be true. We don't know that he really said any of that, but it could be true because it does unleash something. It's like the earth shakes then. So why was that such a big deal?
If we think about it, all governments have to claim legitimacy from somewhere if they are going to be stable, authoritative structures that can govern effectively, fairly, protect people's rights. These days, we in democratic societies, legitimacy comes from the people. We elect a government, and that's where their authority comes from. We, the people, imbue our governments with authority and then they rule us. We have to rethink that completely for the Middle Ages. Authority lies with God. Everyone accepts that authority lies with God. God then gives authority to rulers on earth. And in England and other kingdoms in Western Europe, that comes through the ceremony of coronation and anointing. There is no provision to remove an anointed king. There is no next election. The big dilemma that political theorists had to wrestle with in this period was they could define tyranny as opposed to kingship. That is, if a king ruled in the common interest according to the law, then a tyrant ruled not in the common interest and not according to the law. The big question was, though, if you can identify tyranny, that's all well and good, but what can you do about it? Do you just have to wait for God to act? Or might God be acting through you if you stand up to challenge this? So the difficulty for Henry is, it is clear he comes back. Some of the nobles, the Percys in particular, rally to him. Richard has gone off to Ireland at this point with an army, and by the time Richard can come back, England has fallen. The whole of England has rallied to Henry. Henry has every reason in that moment to think, well, God perhaps is speaking. God is not backing Richard. God is speaking through me. How can that be legitimized when he is not Richard's son? He is not. There has been a deposition before in 1327. Edward II, for not exactly the same, but similar reasons, had lost his crown, but he had a 14-year-old son. So you could quickly shift the crown from one to the other and then pretend that nothing too untoward had happened. Richard has no children. So Henry is, in practical terms, the only possible candidate. There are other cousins, but the cousin Edmund Mortimer, who might have a superior claim to Henry, he's descended from John of Gaunt's older brother, the second son of Edward III, but through the female line. But he's also a little boy. And whatever anyone knows at this point is that having another little boy become king is not going to be a good idea. So Henry has to take the crown for reasons of realpolitik. He's the pragmatic choice, and then retrofit a claim, a legitimate claim. And he puts one together by bolting together three different ideas. He is descended from royal blood. He's Richard's cousin. He's descended from Henry III. He has come back and taken the kingdom, but he doesn't want to say that he's claiming by right of conquest, because that would mean he could rewrite all the laws, which is what he's come to protect. And he's also being acclaimed in a parliament as he does this, but he also doesn't want to say he's getting his authority from parliament, because that's the wrong way around. So he alludes to all these three ideas and then basically says, well, I am king because God has made me so. And he's hoping that that will be enough, that God will have spoken and it will all calm down again. But of course, as you're making clear, the problem he's left with is that anyone who is dissatisfied with his rule isn't just going to have to say, as in any normal reign, well, he's the king, what are we going to do about it? And everyone seems fairly happy with this. They can immediately say, you're not the rightful king. Somebody else has a better claim than you. I'm going to stand up for the true rightful king, and I'm going to gather rebels at my back. And that is what happens repeatedly during Henry's reign. Now, your question about the Wars of the Roses is a brilliant one, of course. Is this a fatal instability in this new dynasty that it's always going to play out in civil war later on? My answer is no, because our Henry, that we've been talking about, Henry IV, does manage to see off all these rebellions, and he does manage to pass on the crown to his son Henry V, who is one of the most able, if not the most able men ever to rule medieval England. He whips everything into shape, goes off and beats the French, conquers half of France, is doing a pretty good job of that too, and dies suddenly and young. At that point, if there was a fatal flaw, we would expect to see it come out. He leaves a 9-month-old baby as his heir, but it takes 20 years for problems, real problems, to begin to emerge. And it's down to the fact that that king, Henry VI, is a complete no-hoper. So I would argue it's not a fatal flaw that's always going to result in the Wars of the Roses, but your point still stands, because when those problems do emerge, how is anyone going to justify resistance to Henry VI, which is again going to have to happen in order to save England from the very different problems that Henry VI is posing? Well, there's something you can look back to. Richard II in 1399, an anointed king, has been deposed and replaced by a cousin, a usurper, in the attempt to save England. That's a precedent that can't be undone.
Right. And his place in the succession, Mortimer, that was fine. And I think that gets solved. And Mortimer doesn't grow up and then say it should be me. It's York who finds a way to trace his ancestry and say, well, it should have been me all along, kind of thing. But this is this amazing moment where you have Henry IV, and Richard, these two cousins, in this moment. Now, you mentioned what kind of king Henry IV goes on to be and how he does put down these rebellions. I think he gets overlooked a lot because, of course, in Shakespeare, we have bright, shiny Prince Hal, who we know is going to become bright, shiny Henry V. So what do we lose? What do we not know enough about Henry IV?
I think you're so right. He gets overlooked. And I think Shakespeare has a lot to do with that. But it's also to do with the fact that his reign is a mess. And it's a mess for him. It's a mess for us. It was a mess for me when I was trying to work out how to tell that bit of the story. Richard is so theatrical, and there's such a wonderfully, well, not for Richard, but a wonderfully dramatic arc to his reign. It's a reign that lends itself to narrative, whereas Henry's reign is firefighting, really, from the very beginning. It's firefighting within England because there's a series of rebellions within England, and it's firefighting externally because every enemy that England has ever had sees their chance. Not only Scotland raiding over the northern border, the French, who managed not formally to break the truce that Richard has arranged with them, but are raiding and sniping and using every weapon at their disposal around the edges of that truce to undermine Henry, who they don't recognise as rightful King of England. And then, for the one and only time in the history of Wales since Wales was conquered in the 1280s, there's a really dangerous war of independence in Wales, an attempt, a rebellion, Owen Glendower's rebellion in Wales, and an attempt to fight for independent rule in Wales. So Henry doesn't know which way to turn, really. He's an excellent soldier, but his hands are too full. And not only that, but just when in 1405, 1406, he's seen off what turn out to be the worst of the challenges he faces, suddenly his health collapses. And even though he's not an old man at all, He's not yet 40 at that point. But illness striking for his enemies, of course, they seize on it with glee, but also one suspects for Henry himself. Is that a sign that God does not approve of what he has done? And I think Henry is one of the most interesting and human characters that it's possible to see among the late medieval kings of England, because in those later years, you see a man who is the polar opposite of Richard. He doesn't, if people stand up to him, if people, loyal councillors, tell him he's doing things wrong, including his Archbishop of Canterbury, a remarkable, very able man called Thomas Arundel, Archbishop Arundel, who really tell him when they think he's done things wrong. Henry doesn't say any variation on off with his head. Henry listens, and in the last years of what turned out to be last years of his reign and his life, Archbishop Arundel really becomes a spiritual mentor to Henry. And when Henry writes his will, in a moment when he's, it turns out not to be his last illness, but a moment when he's suffering desperately with this chronic illness that he has, he begins his will in English, in the first person singular, no royal we for him. I, Henry, sinful wretch, King of England, France, Lord of Ireland, and so on. There's a real sense that he is wrestling with his conscience about what he's had to do. I think he's a fascinating character. He's just a difficult one to fit in to this glorious narrative arc that Shakespeare was working with, from Richard all the way through to the Wars of the Roses.
Yes, and it is his humanity really stands out, especially I think in your book, where you give him the time and the space that Shakespeare doesn't so much, but you really give him so that we can see that he is willing to accept counsel, that he is interested in trying his best to put out all these fires, and as you say, from every angle. And really the only evidence of success we have is his son, and he's not around to see that. He knows as he's dying, his son's going to take the throne. So the final thing, as he is older and ill and writing this will, what is his relationship with the boy Shakespeare calls Prince Hal, that we see, in this fun-loving but bad relationship with his father kind of way? What do we know about Henry V as a young man, as a prince, and Henry IV in their relationship?
The first thing I have to say, and I'm very sorry to have to say this to anyone who loves the Shakespeare plays, which are, of course, wonderful, but fun-loving Hal, really, I mean, there are some rumors at various stages that get elaborated into myths cut out of whole cloth later in the 15th and into the 16th century, but you can't really see fun-loving Hal in the historical record, not least because Hal too, if we're going to call him that, has his hands full. He becomes Prince of Wales at the age of, am I going to get this right, 13, 14, when his father takes the throne. And what kicks off in Wales almost immediately? Owen Glendower's rebellion. So as a young, very young man, a young teenager, young Prince Henry is packed off to Wales by his father with another familiar name, Harry Percy, Hotspur, as one of his mentors there, to hold the line against Glendower's rebels, who are waging a very, very challenging guerrilla war against the English authorities in Wales. And what you see is that young Hal takes to warfare like a duck to water. He's not, as his father had been, a chivalric knight enjoying the joust, enjoying fine clothes and displaying himself in the chivalric culture of Europe. He's fighting a dirty war from very, very early. And then in 1403, when the biggest, it's a difficult assessment to make, but the biggest revolt that takes place in the reign erupts, and it's led by his mentor, Hotspur. And a pitched battle is fought at Shrewsbury on English soil between two English armies. This is an extraordinary moment. We know, I think, a lot of us, those of us who know what's coming at Agincourt, but also what's been at Crecy, we know how powerful English and Welsh longbowmen were. Well, this is an army with longbowmen on both sides. This is could have been mutual assured destruction, but young Prince Hal takes an arrow full in the face at that battle. At the age of 16, he obviously looks up with his visor up at exactly the wrong time and takes an arrow under one eye, which gets stuck 6 inches deep in the back of his skull. It's a devastating wound, and what he does is he pulls out the shaft and carries on fighting. This boy is astonishingly brave. He's an astonishingly able soldier. And from that moment on, and it takes a long time for him to recover from that wound, the wound has to be, the king's surgeon has to find a way to stop it being infected while opening the wound enough to use a special metal implement that he's designed and made specially for the job to get the arrowhead out of the back of Hal's skull. And quite how it missed his eye, his brainstem, it's an extraordinary thing. That recovery, I think, is the thing that convinces Hal that God has a special mission in mind for him. When I wrote a book about Joan of Arc years ago, one of the reasons I started with a description of the Battle of Agincourt is that the one point of comparison for Joan that I could see on the English side was Henry himself, that undaunted, unwavering faith that God was with him. And so what we have to remember, I think, in terms of his relationship with his father, is that they really didn't spend much time together. Right. From a very early age, young Henry hadn't really seen that much of his father, who was either embroiled in political conflict or off gallivanting around Europe or in exile. And then Henry the father, wherever he needed to be in government, Henry the Younger in Wales fighting the rebels, and so on. So I think by what turned out to be the last years of the reign, Henry IV knows how able his son is. And that he also very clearly loved his family, loved his children, loved, as far as we can tell, both his wives. It's a rarity in this period that we can see just how much Henry IV liked women and took them seriously. And I don't mean in a Charles II having a hard way. I mean, he took women seriously as human beings. May sound like a big claim, but there are a number of stories in his life that make that clear. He loved his family, but I think his love for his son, his oldest son, was not a very comfortable or easy love, because this young, able man wanted control of government sooner rather than later. And when Henry IV was very ill, that came in handy because the prince could step up. When Henry recovered a bit and wanted to point out that actually he was still king, that got a bit more tricky. So it was a relationship full of complication and tension. But I think when Henry finally died, wasn't even quite yet 46, which from my vantage point seems like a spring chicken. But I think when Henry finally died, I think he knew he was leaving the country in safe hands.
Yes. And it wasn't a miraculous change on the part of Prince Hal becoming Henry V. He had been a dedicated warrior supporting the government of his father.
And a very, very able administrator as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, way back when I was doing my PhD on the Duchy of Lancaster and reading through all the annual accounts of the Duchy of Lancaster from before Henry became king and then on through, in Henry IV's reign, the Duchy of Lancaster is really left to get on by, it's his own power base. He's going to let them do their own thing and just rely on them to do the job he needs them to do. The minute Henry V takes over, it's almost as though you can feel a cold wind blowing down the corridors that these administrators are working in, because this is a king who's saying, I want to know where every single penny is and where it's going. And that grip on government is the foundation on which he builds his military campaigns.
Right. And unfortunately, we have to say that becomes another story, and maybe you'll take that on next. But okay.
I should say that Dan Jones has done a marvelous job with Henry V's new book out now. So I do urge you all to go on to that next chapter.
Yes. So yes, do that next. That's great. So can we ask, are you working on something else now? What can we look forward to?
I am. I'm still in the relatively early stages. I'm a very slow writer, but I am going on to Elizabeth I, who famously said in 1601, I am Richard II, know ye not that. So it does feel as though there's a bridge. I don't agree she's Richard II, because she was such an able, shrewd ruler, which Richard certainly wasn't. But there are interesting parallels between the 1390s and the 1590s. Yes. She's someone who's fascinated me forever. She intimidates me. I think she intimidated most people she met. But I am really interested to find out where this book is going to go.
Oh, that is wonderful news to me. I'm very fond, and in fact, I was able to get you to sign. So I have met you, your little book on Elizabeth and her insecurity, which is a very interesting way to look at her. So, all that is great. Tell us where we can follow you to know what's coming.
I am on Instagram, and I'm still on X. I'm not very good on social media, so I'm just clinging on to those two footholds. But the main place that I would love anyone who would like to come and chat or read about what I'm doing next is Substack. I have a Substack called the H Files. I post there weekly, sometimes about highways and byways of books I've already written, things that didn't make it into the books or things that I'm reconsidering. And I'm just beginning to start posting about Elizabeth I and thoughts that I'm having on this new journey. So I would love anyone who'd like to come and join the conversation to come and have a look at Substack.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I encourage you all to do that. We'll have all of these links in the show notes. So that is wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been just a treat to get to speak with you and learn more about this time period, which is so important. And we sometimes kind of look past it from the 100 Years' War, and then we zoom into the Wars of the Roses and don't look at this big moment here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, good. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we will see you next time on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Thank you for listening to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I really appreciate your support. If you could take a moment, leave us a rating, maybe share with a friend. Also, a huge thank you to all my patrons who literally make this all possible. Thank you so much, and join us again to hear about ways that history shows us what's possible. Thank you.